Welcome, I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. Today we'll be talking about lesson 3 of our study, which covers the Gospel According to John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 25. Moving on, in lesson 1 we saw the importance, and 2 we saw the importance of John the Baptist as someone who bears witness to Jesus. We also talked about how he is one of very few people, too, we'll see the other one here in this lesson, who has an understanding of who Jesus is as God at this point and not just as some guy. And we saw how that shaped all of John's life, but especially as his role as witness to Jesus, and the impact it had on his interactions. We did not actually see in the Gospel according to John any direct interaction between John the Baptist / witness and Jesus. We saw John talk to the people following him. We saw Jesus where John was, but we did not see a direct conversation between that John and Jesus. His role was to be kind of over here and talking about Jesus as one of these two people. Doesn't mean they never talked. It's just the way it was pitched here in this gospel. His role was to be kind of outward facing about Jesus. We're going to see a very different interaction in our lesson today, which is one of the more fascinating interactions in all of the scriptures. Very hard to unpack, and I don't claim we will fully explain everything about it, but we can definitely all have some interesting things to think about as we go forth. So, there is a wedding at Cana in Galilee, which is, again, not in Jerusalem. We're not starting Jesus' ministry here in the Holy Land. He's met John, he's picked up some disciples, and he's immediately kind of going home. And he's going home for a wedding celebration. And this really marks the first event in his public ministry, is this wedding, which is something that we will talk more about as we unpack this as well. Why does Jesus' ministry start with a wedding? To spoil a little bit of where we're going, I think we can view most of Jesus' ministry here, at least in the first half of this gospel, as a courtship of God and humanity, leading toward a different sort of wedding. We talked in the prologue and after, especially in the prologue, though, about Jesus' role here to those who believe he gave power to become children of God. We do that through adoption and a sort of a rebirth, which we'll talk about in the next lesson as well. But that is the thing wherein that idea of wedding the humanity in us with the divinity of God is realized in the person of Jesus already, but the promise of that incarnation is the same will be true, and divinity and humanity will be intermingled in all of us. And so Jesus' ministry starts with this wedding, not his wedding, and points toward a different wedding, which is kind of presided over by him, but available to all of us, a wedding and a union between humanity and God. So it's extremely appropriate in that context that his ministry starts, or this first major event starts at a wedding in Cana at Galilee. And Jesus' mother is there, also important. In fact, as the way the wedding is pitched, she's more important than Jesus. There was a wedding, Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his followers were invited. But the story, the framing of the wedding is more significantly Jesus' mother being there, and then Jesus, which is not uncharacteristic also of the import of the wedding of humanity and divinity, also starts with Jesus' mother, and then comes to pass through the person of Jesus. But she's the entry point also for the wedding of humanity and divinity. through her union with God that leads to the incarnation. And then Jesus comes after. And then Jesus' followers come after. So we've set up this wedding as an excellent metaphor for what Jesus is working to accomplish. And then we have a problem statement. Also worth thinking about in the conversations we've seen thus far between Jesus and people, and the ones we will largely continue to see, Jesus starts the conversation. What are you looking for? Or various other things. We'll see usually someone approaches Jesus, Jesus starts the conversation. And he starts it by addressing kind of a fundamental problem that they have. This is not like other conversations in the Gospel according to John. Jesus is not starting the conversation, and he's not framing what's being talked about or how. The conversation is started from his mother, who says they have no wine. As the conversation progresses, we'll dig in a little bit more to some of the deeper significance potentially of that statement. For now, let's just take it at its face value, although we won't leave it there. She sees a problem. She recognizes that her son has the ability to solve that problem. And here there's no, I'm coming to you and not stating exactly what I want, like everybody else either. There is, this is what I want. I'm going to show up and directly tell you what I want, and directly expect that you can and will do something about it, all contained in that one statement. And as we move forward, we'll see what happens from there. All right. We started this conversation. Jesus' mom came to him with a question or a problem or a statement. We have no wine. Now we see Jesus' response. And this again is an occasion to comment on translation. Translation here in our study from the Revised Standard Version is, "What have you to do with me?" Which really, I think, is a fairly bad mischaracterization of how I read the Greek statement here. So how I read this in the Greek is, what does this have to do with you and with me? Which is very different than what have you to do with me? And frames it differently. The translation here frames this as a everyone and Jesus' mother versus Jesus problem. Whereas I think more accurately, the better translation frames this as a everyone versus Jesus and his mother problem. And that's where we start to dig into what really is the problem. What does it mean they have no wine? And why is she concerned about that? It's not really her problem or her concern that somebody throwing a wedding failed to buy enough wine. But in the context of a wedding, what does that represent? The wine really is an almost essential part of the celebration. Everybody's around, they're celebrating, they're getting loose, they're having fun, and the wine is definitely a part of bringing everybody together and doing that. It's a thing that allows for the joy and celebration of the wedding. And humanity can certainly be seen prior to the coming of Jesus as being in a state where something essential is missing that guarantees or ensures their joy. That keeps them from being able to come together in joy and in celebration truly over the state and status of their lives. There's a fundamental lack in humanity. So you can see in his mother's statement a suggestion that she's showing concern not only about this one wedding celebration, but about the fundamental state of humanity. and their relationship to one another and to God, and the joy in their lives. Something that is not directly the concern of her or of Jesus, because they're not without that. That is these human people who aren't Jesus and his mother problem. Jesus and his mother in that context have plenty of wine, or have the joy of God, because they alone are without the stain of original sin. They have communion with God already, whereas the others don't. So Jesus' question, what is it to you and me? Again, remember, Jesus responds to kind of the core, stated and unstated part of what someone asks. He's kind of like, we see, and this is a fascinating thing, we see, based on how she responds, this reads as a denial, right? It's easy to see in this, he's challenging and pushing back on her. He says, what is this to you and me? My hour has not yet come. She takes that as an assent. She points to the servants and says, do whatever he tells you. She reads in his answer, not resistance, not denial, just a statement of, why is this a concern? That's them, this is us. And kind of leaves it to her to choose. What are we doing? This doesn't directly affect us. And it is, in this context, you can see it as Jesus' real public ministry starting at the request of his mother. Let's do something about this problem with humanity. They're not in union with God. You're God. Do something about it. And him saying, my hour has not yet come, there's a cost to this, right? Do you know what you're asking? This is not free, this thing that you're asking. Is that what you want is now when we're doing this? And she, by suggesting yes, move forward, there's a very real sense in which you can interpret this conversation with Jesus' mother being the one that starts his pathway to the cross. And we see almost immediately after this, but we'll get into it later, after the wedding, the next thing we see Jesus do is go start public ministry in Jerusalem and start on his pathway to antagonizing the Jewish leaders that ultimately leads to the cross, which leads to the redemption of humanity. So he starts bringing about his hour immediately following this conversation. So he has interpreted this not just as, I should solve the problem of there's no wine at this wedding, but we see by what he chooses to do broader engagement as well. But most significantly, we shouldn't read in this any kind of conflict between Jesus and his mother, which I've definitely heard various commentators mention. Because look at what he does. What he does is what she wants. He does not ever say no, and she just points to a servant and says, yeah, that means yes, do what he tells you. And she's still not the one doing it, he's still the one doing it, but we should read in his response assent, which is the thing that makes it so odd. So we'll see where that goes from here, but moving forward, Jesus has agreed to solve the problem that was raised. We left off with, do whatever he tells you. Now we see, what is it that Jesus tells them? There are around 6 jars, not jars like jars, but jars like jars, used for Jewish purification rites, which is certainly not an accident, either the number or the substance of what these things are. The number 6, of course, from the very beginning of the Bible, has significance as takes its significance from the creation account, the first creation account, where the world is created in 6 days, and then it's on the 7th day that God rests. And then the idea of 6 then is an idea of something not really done yet. Done but not done. Just as the world was made, but God as a craftsman, it was an equally essential part of rounding it all out and bringing it to more of a fullness we see in that 7th day. And even beyond that, we see that 7th day also points to a need for a further completion, which we've talked about in more length in other studies. And 8 is the truly perfect and complete number, but 7 is a finished week, whereas 6 is a very much not finished thing. So we see here, one, we have the number of these jars suggesting an unfinished thing, and 2, we see they're used for Jewish purification rites. So the suggestion is, if the problem is humanity is lacking something essential, what we're seeing is we have this thing that is incomplete and imperfect in the form of water in these jars, and the way Jews went about purifying themselves, cleaning themselves. It didn't work. That was the problem of sin that they had, is the means they had to take away or to atone for their sins didn't work. And so there was not joy in their lives the way God intended it, because they couldn't deal with the problem of sin. They had this incomplete, not completely lacking, it wasn't zero, but incomplete means of purifying their sins. And it was just sitting there. So Jesus, symbolically, again in response to the fundamental problem, takes, here at the wedding, he just takes water and makes it wine, which is a pretty cool thing to be able to do. But the larger significance is that he can take these incomplete purification rites that the Jews were so intent on practicing, and from them turn them into something entirely different that restores that thing that's lacking to humanity, that restores that joy to humanity. And we see also that uncharacteristically, the new thing is better than the old thing. The Jews were definitely expecting a Messiah, a new king to come in, somebody like David. They were mostly expecting that to be a fulfillment of and a reflection of what had already been, and kind of coming out of and following the law as they knew it. What they weren't expecting is a new and better thing that came after, that changed everything that went before. That's part of why they have so much trouble accepting Jesus as the Messiah, many of them, is because they were expecting something that just fit tidily within what they already had, and everything that came before was better, and then we have a kind of an extension of that coming next, not a fundamentally new, much better thing coming after the start and the foundation. But again, we know the start and the foundation was imperfect and incomplete. So a new thing that completes it will necessarily be much better and much different, and make sense out of everything that came before in a different way. And so this first sign, this first act here, is a foreshadowing of the entirety of what Jesus is here to do, his life and his public ministry. And he brings out of Judaism itself, symbolized in these 6 jars used for purification, he brings out of that a whole lot of wine for humanity, more than anybody would rationally need, a superabundance of joy coming for humanity as a result of what he's doing. And that is the answer to his mother's problem statement, is not, hey, let's get everyone drunk at this wedding, because Jesus is not all about that. It's more, let's get humanity drunk on the joy of God, intoxicated with the presence and the union with God. That's what he's doing here. And that's available to all of us if we would drink freely of the grace of God. Now, the evangelist summarizes this thing that Jesus just did as the first sign that Jesus did in Cana at Galilee. I think there's a fair expectation that this is not the first miracle that Jesus did in his lifetime, based on how trivial it seemed to his mother that he would just be able to fix this. And John later mentions that the sum total of everything that Jesus, all the works that Jesus did, wouldn't fit in any book. So there's a fundamental difference in the Gospel according to John between a miracle and a sign. And the narrative of the Gospel is going to focus on a relatively small number of signs. These signs all being things that point beyond what has happened to something else, something deeper and more profound. They all point to what it is that Jesus is trying to do at a deeper level to humanity and for humanity. We talked in the prologue about the inability of our senses to access God. God is not something that we can comprehend with sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. Instead, we have the theological senses of faith, hope, and love that allow us to, in a sense, grasp God. And God being outside of the normal channel of how we perceive things can be very hard if you don't already have some measure of faith to apprehend. These signs of Jesus are things that point beyond what our senses see toward a deeper reality, toward where God is acting. So for those who would see with faith, you can see in these signs of Jesus a thing deeper and beyond, which is what makes these characteristically different than a miracle. A miracle might just be a testimony to God by, look at God's great power, I see this thing happen, wow. And Jesus did a lot of those, and in the Synoptic Gospels, that's a major focus. As these things that kind of the end of them and the meaning is in the thing itself, and it's a manifestation of the power of God. The signs in the Gospel according to John are all things that are meant to point toward the deeper reality of what God is trying to do with and for humanity. And in that we see also there's a continuation of this idea of these signs in our world and in our church today. We have 7 now signs that are things still in our church today that are tangible things that we can experience with our senses that also point to a deeper reality of what God's trying to do to humanity. Except in these 7 sacraments, God does it. They are still the ways, the change that these signs, this gospel is foreshadowing is affected still in a way, it's brought about, it's realized for us now still in a way that is tangible and accessible to our senses, but is also a deeper thing that happens simultaneously on a physical and on a spiritual level. Jesus liked this idea of pointing us to the invisible by means of the visible. It's not just John having this idea, it's a thing Jesus did. First in his ministry and later in his church, that John seems to have uniquely grasped in a way that he wanted to demonstrate to us. Jesus' life itself is on earth is such a sign, is such a sacrament. The incarnation is that. It is God making visible and sensible the invisible God. Everything about what Jesus did on earth is that kind of sign. And then extending from that are these other signs, these other sacraments. And they reveal what? Ultimately, they reveal the glory of God. The Greek word for glory is peripherally related to a word for how things seem or how they appear. In the glory of God, it's like they make visible God in his glory and what he looks like. But shielded and protected behind, because the Old Testament tradition was you cannot see the face of God and live. The full glory of God is still shielded behind sensible, tangible things, but through the eyes of faith, hope, and love, we can, in these signs, see Almighty, all-powerful God directly. So the wedding and the first sign of Jesus has drawn to an end. Now we get, as will become extremely common in John's Gospel, a scene change. Again, I think this is relevant to the theory that all of this is inspired by, at the very least, drama. So everything in this Gospel is, you've got a series of scenes where different groups of people come together, and most of the action happens in the form of a conversation. Even the sign about the wine, the water becoming wine, the action of that was conversation. It was just pull some water out of this thing that used to be water and take it to someone. And the sign is realized by conversation, by someone drinking and then commenting on it. It's not done by, and the water became wine when Jesus said this, and he said the right magic words, and then the water was wine. It's all done through dialogue, through the word, which is both a realization of this being inspired by drama, but it also says something fundamental about Jesus. Jesus is pitched from the beginning of this gospel as God's word, God's creative word, the fulfillment of, you've had your 7 days of creation, God spoke the world into existence, now you've got your 8th perfect completing day when God is again speaking into the world in the form of himself, and his creative voice has entered the world. So of course what Jesus is doing is happening as a result of speech, and not only in water becoming wine, but in the conversations he has with people along the way as well. So it works out kind of twofold, and I think both sides of how that works out are important. From the point of view of structurally of the gospel, it also means we're going to see these scenes. Jesus calling a couple of disciples, scene change. Jesus at a wedding, scene change. Jesus moving on. We're going to see a lot of shifts in where we are, and then conversations that happen, and then shifts again. So here, we're no longer at the wedding. We've moved on. Again, we're not actually at Jerusalem yet. He stayed around where he was more or less for now, but pretty quickly that is going to be shifting as well. There's a map in the study that you can use to kind of track Jesus' work. Of greatest interest is most of what he chooses, where he chooses to be, is not around Jerusalem and Judah, except during the major feasts, when he'll go there and then he'll head back up, largely back up north, for the time when he's not involved directly in one of these feasts, which is what he does here. He stays north until it's time to go celebrate a feast in Jerusalem, which we're about to get to. Also worth noting, the study covers it in some detail and provides some references. This idea of Jesus' brethren, brothers, we know from the dogma of the perpetual virginity of Mary, that can't be her children and Jesus' full biological brothers. And you can read more in the study about exactly what is behind that. Not Jesus' full brothers. Here we see the first feast that Jesus celebrates in the Gospel according to John, and he really starts it off with a bang. So, it surely also is not an accident that Jesus' public ministry here really gets started with the celebration of the Passover just as it ends with the celebration of the Passover. We'll kind of leave that thread lingering at this point and potentially come back to it many lessons from now when we wrap back around to the end of all of this and talk about how it was foreshadowed in the beginning. But for now, it is worth mentioning this is a great way to get a lot of publicity right away, but it is not a great way to win any friends. It is immediately setting Jesus' agenda against that of the Jewish leaders, who clearly have allowed this to happen in the temple area, not the inner sacred part of the temple, but in the compound that is the temple. If you think about Catholic parish, this wouldn't be in the sanctuary, but it would be within the building of the church. All the same, you would be letting businesses open up and thriving based around religious practices, but at least maybe not in the sanctuary. But still, is that really a thing that belongs in the church? To have a McDonald's outside in your church, and maybe a Subway and some other things, so when you're leaving church, you can swing by for your lunch right away after Mass. No, that's probably not a good idea. If any of you are in parishes that do that, I'm sorry, and that's the thing to take up with your pastor. Maybe it's not that bad. My analogy is bad, but it seems not great to me. And it seems not great to Jesus, right? What's the problem? Is Jesus against people working and making money? You notice, I think that what he does with the doves kind of highlights an important thing here. He drives the people and the animals out. He lets the people who have birds that would fly away, and it would harm their livelihood if he just let them all fly away. Then he lets calmly take their doves out. So he's not actually doing harm to anyone's livelihood here. But he is saying this does not belong, this thing that you're doing, in the temple. Get it out. And the money changers is fairly aggressive about turning over their tables. But in the long run, he's not actually damaging anyone's livelihood. He's moving it, and aggressively moving it. Why? The idea of holiness in the Old Testament and the New Testament is an idea of things being set apart. You make something holy, you make something sacred by setting it apart, so that when you then take the normal fare of the world and mix it in with something that's meant to be set apart, it ceases to be set apart. So here we see the temple is being mingled with everything that happens outside of the temple. It's a form of desanctifying the temple, and of mixing the world with God, which is not a thing that Jesus is ever going to be okay with, here in the gospel or here in his life. So not only, and in our lives, so not only is he framing his public ministry in contrast to the Jewish leadership. They've all said this is okay, I'm telling you it's not. But he's also framing it in terms of, and remember, this is like their high feast day, in terms of things are set apart for God to make them sacred. We don't mix the world into the things that are of God. God and the world have to be separate in order for the things of God to be done correctly, which is an extremely important distinction, and one that's easy to start missing in our own lives. It's very easy to start allowing matters of convenience or all the other justifications and rationality we have with ourselves to say it's okay to blur these lines. I don't need hard, fast lines in my life between what is sacred and where God is and what is not. If I mix them, that'll just allow God to spread out into these other things. And it'll make the other parts of my life more holy if I break down the lines. And that's not ever the way it happens. It always goes the other way. It always dilutes God and crowds out God. It never crowds out the world with God when we mingle the lines. So it's very important for our own practice of the Christian life that we have hard, fast lines and boundaries, that we set things apart for God, whether it be a set prayer time every day, or a way we choose to celebrate the Sabbath, or what we do with family, or there are many different types and ways that we can sanctify things in our lives by setting them apart and putting God first in them. And how exactly or what exactly that looks like, less important than it has to be completely set apart and dedicated to God. And here we see Jesus making that point very strongly, and it will continue to be foundational to, you can't accomplish any of what Jesus is calling people to do if you can't do that right. Zeal for your house will consume me, is what his disciples call to mind when this happens. Again, a few different dimensions here to how this is manifesting. There was a group at that time in Jerusalem called the Zealots, who were fairly radical and were encouraging behavior that was fairly radical, mostly toward the Romans, but otherwise not entirely unlike what it is that Jesus is doing here. It's just directed more toward the Romans than the Jewish leaders. What is zeal? The word zealous sounds a great deal like the word jealous, because they come from the same root. Zeal is jealousy. It is at its core. So here, Jesus' zealousness for the things of God. God is a jealous God. When we are giving our attention to God, He demands our full attention. It's not, I'll be around where God is in the temple area, but I'm not going to stop doing my business and stop following my own agenda. No. When you're in your place and your time and the things that are set apart for God, that has to be God's, completely God's, or it's frankly not going to be very effective. God will always try to reach us and to work with us where we are, but to really have a relationship with Him, to really make progress in the spiritual life, we have to set aside everything that's not God and make that time about God. Imagine going on a date with somebody and spending the whole time flirting with the waitress instead. You're not going to get very far. In fact, you're going to get the opposite of very far, and deservedly so. Imagine sitting in prayer time with God and spending all your time thinking about your job. You're doing the same thing. You're giving your attention and your focus elsewhere. And when you do it, God is going to get bored and leave. And maybe throw a drink in your face. Probably not. But you're not going to succeed in building relationship with God, which is your goal. God is jealous, and He demands your full attention when you are working with Him, when you are praying, when you are trying to build that relationship. So the big takeaway here is that we need to find a way to do that, and the world has many, many distractions in them. So when you're looking to figure out how am I going to sanctify, to set apart some of my life, the big thing is, how do I take all these distractions and find a way to push them all to the side so that there can be just me and God? Obviously, what Jesus has done here draws some attention from the Jewish leaders, who were not maybe entirely predisposed to liking the idea of Him getting a lot of attention in general, but then the way He went about doing it also certainly didn't help. But they're also not immediately willing to automatically dismiss that there could be some legitimacy to this guy. They start with a challenge, which is one that persists throughout the way many people start to react to Jesus, and we can fall into this as well. What sign can you do to justify this thing that you're doing? What proof do you have? What can you demonstrate that says this is a permissible thing? note, they're not actually engaging in a conversation about what is better here, doing commerce in the temple area or not doing commerce in the temple area. They could have a very fruitful and interesting conversation and even debate about, should we be allowing all of this business to be occurring in the temple area here? Instead of doing that, he's kind of thrown the gauntlet down by doing that, so they're coming at him. They're immediately positioning him on a side that's not theirs and asking for a justification that should be impossible for what he's doing, right? The degree to which they really think there hasn't been a prophet in a long time, the degree to which they really think he's going to work some prophet level miracle to justify what he's been doing, that seems impossible within the current version of their worldview. So they're really attempting to just say, you have no credibility, we're the authority, you shouldn't be doing this. Yeah, it's just a big it's just a way of attempting to discredit Jesus. And again, he responds to people in the way that they come to him. So they ask for a sign that they believe is ridiculous and impossible, and what does he say? Well, if you happen to destroy this temple, that of course you have no inclination to destroy, don't worry, in 3 days I'll raise it up again. That is an equally preposterous sign, because what they're asking for is do something now. And what he's saying is, I absolutely have a sign for you. It's in the future. It'll make sense later in some hypothetical future event. Again, responding to the ridiculous with the ridiculous. But also not, right? It ends up working on multiple levels. But initially, to their point, we've been building this temple for 46 years. We're not really inclined to destroy it at this point. There's also a shift in words. In the RSV here, temple gets translated in the beginning of this encounter with the commerce happening in the temple or temple area. And here also, both words get translated as temple. The Greek version has two different words there. The temple area referring again to the whole compound. Jesus' answer here, destroy this temple, referring to the more inner sacred part of it, which has relevance when we see how Jesus' followers eventually interpret what he said here. But initially, until we get to the magic of hindsight in how we view this, just taken at its face, the Jewish leaders asked a thing that they believe is ridiculous, and Jesus responds and again gives them a thing that seems ridiculous. The difference being what Jesus gives them is not at all ridiculous and actually is a sign that justifies everything he's talking about for anyone who can see it. So it's just a fascinating way that he behaves in terms of responding to people both with the tone that they are meeting him with, but also not taking substance or meaning out of what he's doing. He's still also giving them what they are actually looking for if they're trying to look. If they're really trying to see, is there anything to this Jesus guy, whether they get it yet or not, there will be a time when they could understand and they could find exactly what they were looking for in what he said if they're open to looking at it. And we'll see in a minute, his followers do eventually follow that path that he laid and get to that was the sign. But initially it just seems like kind of a bogus exchange where everybody's posturing a little bit. But turns out Jesus isn't. So we alluded some in the last question. Jesus again had a double meaning in what he was saying. He wasn't just talking about and in fact we see then a fundamental shift in what is the important space for the worship of God. The temple was originally important because it was built to be the house of God. The Ark of the Covenant was put in the temple. That is where God dwelt. and that's what made it sacred. Well, we know Jesus in his person is a fundamentally new kind of where God dwelt. We saw in the prologue, the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. Jesus is a new kind of temple. He is the dwelling place of God on earth in a different and fuller way than ever the building could be. So, of course, he's talking about the temple of his body, but in doing so, he's also saying this old temple is no longer relevant because God has a new kind of dwelling with his people, and it's me. So yeah, you can destroy this, but actually, no, you can't, because this is God's permanent dwelling. So you can try, and I will raise it back up again. That shows you that this is truly the sanctified temple, the one that is set apart for God, the one that is the thing that you can't ruin, like you're ruining the temple that's in Jerusalem. You can't make it not holy. You can't make it not sacred. You can't make it dead. You can't do anything to remove that God dwells in this new temple of my body. It is beyond your ability to touch or to alter it, no matter how not holy all of you are. And later his followers realize that. They realize, oh, yeah, actually, that temple is no more. At the point of this conversation, Jesus has fundamentally said, the rules have changed. Already, I'm here. That means this temple behind us is not important. This is now what's important. We've shifted how we're doing worship. We've shifted how we're interacting with how humanity is relating to God fundamentally, and it's happening through the person of me now. And we'll see going as he leaves Jerusalem and this Passover, then he takes the presence of God with him. Jerusalem is no longer the central and the most important place to meet and to worship God. It is wherever Jesus is, which is not always even in the Holy Land, or in Judah at least. So we see also Jesus' disciples later look back and say, oh, duh, we should have gotten that. But of course, how could they? How do you see in the form of a person truly see and recognize God? It will take them some time to get all the way there. But everybody, or many of the people gathered at this feast, are seeing there's something special to this Jesus guy. He's apparently doing a lot more signs than are being reported. He's getting a lot of attention. Everybody's talking about him. And they're already starting to think, we could make this Jesus guy the king. And he could be the fulfillment of what David was and help us get the Romans out. That is not Jesus' view of how any of this works or what he's trying to do. Again, rather than the king, he is the temple. He's drawing fulfillment of the promise of these old things, but not in the way or the type that people are looking for. It's easy to see a new David. It's hard to see a new temple. It's easy-ish to see a new Moses. It's hard to see a new lamb. He's putting himself in the place of all the things that they thought served the purpose of the religion, and they thought these people were the big important things, and the sacrificial lamb and the temple were the less important things. He's showing, no, these were the more important things, and now this is what this was really about, and what was really important. So I'm not here to be your king, I'm here to be your temple, the place where you meet God. I'm not here to be, well, I am going to give you a law, but I'm not here to be a priest to atone for sins. I'm going to be the lamb, the sacrifice that atones for sins. And I'll be the priest that does the atonement. But at least as importantly, I will be the lamb that is sacrificed. So Jesus, God's view of the things from the Old Testament that are important to bring forward is not the same as the Jewish leaders and the people's view of the things that are important to bring forward. And that will continue to be a driving source of their conflict, is everyone is looking for Jesus to be something other than what he is. And by way of conclusion, it's worth pointing out we do the same thing. It is very easy for us also to meet Jesus and want him in our lives to be a particular thing, and to do a particular thing. And we want Jesus, God, to conform himself to our wants and expectations instead of going the other way and conforming ourselves to the will of God. And we can get in a lot of trouble spiritually when we allow that to happen, and it is a very common and human thing to do. That I invite everyone to reflect on. When you encounter God, what is your expectation? Who are you expecting to change, to act, God or you? Prayer becomes much more fruitful when we look at it as a way of conforming ourselves to the will of God instead of trying to get God to do what we want. This has been an overview of Lesson 3 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.